everyone to our second June webinar. We're really excited today to share with you information security from that work from home era. And we have some guest speakers that'll be joining us as well. The COVID-19 pandemic, we know, has completely changed the way employees work. And with that comes key changes to the way IT security is handled. When you add to that a decentralized workforce and one where more and more people are working remotely, there's an increased risk of security breaches. We have Intertek experts here today, Tatiana Dragovola. I'm sorry, I crucified that. That wasn't very good. And Jim Nelson to break down the risks of a remote workforce and the steps companies need to take in order to ensure a more safe and secure network. Our webinar objectives today is to help you learn about the impacts of a remote workforce on IT security, to understand how to mitigate risk of a remote workforce, and to highlight some of the key blind spots in IT security that companies might face when maintaining remote workforce. We're also going to talk a little bit about the information security management system and the audit process changes that might occur. As usual, the recording of our webinar will be available on the ICOR webinar page in about 2 days. And we want you to be very aware that today is a little bit different webinar in that we're going to be asking for you to connect with us. There's lots of polls, and we have several places where we're going to ask you to use the questions pane so that you can answer those questions and share some of your experiences. It just also as a logistics reminder, anyone who attends 35 minutes will get their certificate of attendance. So I'd like to introduce to you our speakers today. We have Jim Nelson. He is BCS president. He also serves as the ICOR board chair and works as an internet auditor in business continuity, information security, and ISO 20000. He's also an expert member of ISO Technical Committee 292, and this is an international standard committee focused on continuity and resilience. We are sad that we've had a last minute cancellation, so Charlie Clark will not be able to be with us today, but instead Tatiana will join us. We're very happy that she has stepped in. She's the lead auditor for the risk program at the Intertek Business Assurance Group, and she acts as an audit team leader for integrated management system audits against ISO 27001, 20001, and 9001. So she's also a lead auditor in conformity assessments for the ISMS, the ITSMS, and the QMS, with a focus on information security in systems like ITIL. We are very excited to have her with us today. So Tatiana, if you could share with us a little bit about Intertek.
Thank you. So for more than 130 years, companies around the world have depended on Intertek to help ensure the quality and safety of their products, processes, and systems. So as you see, we have 3,000 auditors worldwide, 90,000 plus audits. We are operated in more than 100 countries globally. We have more than 1,000 labs and offices, and we provide our services for more 80 plus languages. And next. Thank you. Through our global network of state-of-the-art facilities and industry-leading technical expertise, we provide innovative and bespoke assurance, testing, inspection, and certification services to our customers. We provide a systematic approach to supporting our customers' quality assurance efforts in each of the areas of their operations, including R&D, raw materials, sourcing, components, suppliers, manufacturing, transportation, distribution, retail channels, and consumer management. Next. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing a little bit about Intertek, and there will be contact information when you get the slide, when you can view the slide deck as well to help you see if you'd like to contact them directly. So we're going to start today by looking at some of the trends initiated by the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically at the remote work. One of the things we've seen according to a recent Upwork survey, is that 1 in 4 Americans were working remotely, or have been working remotely in 2021. And this compares to in 2018, only 7% even had the option of working remotely. So to help us get started and learn a little bit about you and who's attending, we'd like to have you share in our first poll your remote work history. So to tell us to what extent you've been working remotely in the past time frame. We only give about 30 seconds for this, so this is not a time to dawdle. Go ahead and answer as quickly as you can, please. So we will give it about 5 more seconds. All right. So interestingly enough, 8% of you have not worked remotely to any extent ever. So my guess is that, and we'll probably learn a little more about this as we get to know you better, but my guess is that you are the people that are probably involved with some of the information security and supporting those people that are working remotely as well. 4% work remotely only when travel. But one of the things that we're seeing is that more than half of you began working remotely during COVID-19, and the about 35% of you have been working remotely for many years. This is actually a little bit higher than some of the statistics. So that's really interesting to see because some of the statistics show that it's as low as like we saw 7 to 10% globally. So there was livecareer.com did a study, and one of the things they wanted to know was, do workers want to return to the office, or would they like to continue to stay in a remote capacity for good? And one of the interesting pieces here is, and we shared this with one of our earlier webinars, is that 61% want their employer to let them work in a remote capacity indefinitely, even after the pandemic is over. And this doesn't mean 5 days a week, but we're saying in some aspects. And the most common amount of numbers for that is usually between 2 and 3 days a week. And then this huge number that says, 29% say that they'll quit if they aren't allowed to continue to remote working in some capacity. And then from those 29%, 62% of those people say that they will give preference to employers that allow remote work, when they actually quit their job because maybe they weren't allowed to do that before. So Microsoft has done a study where they share that large portions of the workforce had never been expected to work remotely, at least to the extent that required, during COVID, were not properly trained. Were not shown how to access appropriate tools, and they weren't given the guidance that they needed in order to work from home. And this is what's really resulted in a lot of the challenges, meaning that there wasn't time. We didn't, if they hadn't had this in their plans, everything was kind of ad-libbed. And so in one survey, IT admins reported that training for remote best practices was the most prevalent problem they had when it came to end user education. So let's go ahead and take our next poll. And this poll wants to know, where do you want to work in the future? And so what are your thoughts as to where you would like to work? I know that there are some people who want to return to the office right now, like they are tired of working from home. And then others of you are saying, I want to work remotely forever. And one of these things is really people have seen the duration of the pandemic has given us the opportunity to kind of change how we operate our lives. And it's created some opportunities for people. And, not just people wanting to change jobs based on whether they get to work remotely or not, but kind of evaluating or reevaluating where they are. So let's go ahead and look at our results. So this is amazing that none of you want to return to the office right now. This is really ironic. They're saying that about, statistically wise, about 40% of the people would like to return back to work. And then this is the other statistically relevant piece is that, hang on, I forgot to share, so now you can see it. 41% of you want to work remotely 3 to 4 days a week. And the biggest numbers for this, like I mentioned earlier, are kind of that 2 to 3 day window. So for people who are planning for how many people are going to be working remotely, especially in the information security field, I think you have to consider that most or a lot of your people are going to be working remotely, if not full time, 2 to 3 days a week. So these are pretty big numbers. And they really are helpful in the planning. So I'd like to take a minute now and have some reflections from Jim and Tatiana, specifically looking at, um, you know, what kind of technical tools we saw in that survey by Microsoft that people didn't have what they needed initially to get going. But what are some of the technical tools that should be provided by the company to ensure that that remote workplace is secure? And maybe Tatiana, if you'd like to start.
Thank you. So when it comes to the tools, there are different layers of infrastructure that should be considered to ensure that the remote workplace is secure. For example, to ensure secure remote access to business assets and online services. Typically, this is provided by virtual private network solutions, which creates an encrypted network connection that makes it safe for the worker to access IT resources within the organizations and elsewhere on the internet or other networks. In addition, consideration of two-factor or multi-factor authentication instead of standard user IDs and passwords is widely implemented within the organization, especially in COVID times. Another things to consider is secure access to business applications and communication collaboration tools. Business today revolves around teamwork using shared knowledge assets, including documents, files, reports, spreadsheets, both structured and unstructured data. Such assets are created and used with applications that include the usual Office productivity suites, such as Microsoft Office 365 or Google G Suite, local content document management systems, corporate intranets, also different HR, financial systems, CRM, ERP, and any others. Also, remote work relies much more on digital communication, especially modern workforce collaboration tools such as Team Chat, such as Slack, Microsoft Teams, and unified communication, instant messaging solutions, as well as standard email, of course, but also web conferencing, meeting tools like GoToMeeting or Zoom. And Jim, do you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do. That was very clearly presented. Thank you. I had noticed the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has been doing a good job on providing information over time in the last period. And recently, in their study, and I think Linda has it cited at the end, they had half a dozen or 6 items or steps to take. Number 4 kind of ties into what Tatiana just talked about, introducing elements of security to teleconferencing. And 1 or 2 of those caught my attention just from what I've been seeing for audits and working remotely during COVID. So one of them is, first off, limit the access codes, which makes sense, but they also say, don't use the same code over and over. So if you're opening a Zoom or a Teams meeting or a GoToMeeting, saying make sure you vary that code so it is not picked up. And again, using a personal PIN and the multi-factor authentication, as Tatiana has just mentioned. They also suggest an additional level of screening, which is kind of that having a room or a green room to allow you to vet to see that the people that are joining are who you expect. And they have several other recommendations, and along with that is again, of course, making sure the attendees, especially if it's sensitive, makes some sense. And they do cite in there some work done by CISA, or the Homeland Security out of the US, their Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. They've actually created a list of teleconferencing platforms, and they provide some additional guidance on how to secure them. So it's maybe not a bad thing to add to your toolkit. And as I've seen, each one of these tools that Tatiana mentioned, whether they're collaboration or working tools, they each have pros and cons, not only the operational, but the security perspective. And I'll just add one last thought and then turn it back to Linda. As an auditor, and I've had the ability, the same as Tatiana, to do audits, business continuity, et cetera, throughout this pandemic. In many cases where organizations that are certified have activated their crisis management plans and then maintained them. So one of the keys I look at is, what teleconferencing tools are they using for business as usual or discussions, or maybe even like a certification audit? And what do they use in an event or an incident? And there's kind of that saying that, oh, it's technology, where there's perhaps some bumps and warts and pimples that occur during tools. So how reliable are these conferencing tools for planning and practice in normal business, but do they also fit well if you need to adjust to a crisis? So with that said, I'll turn it back. Thank you.
All right, thank you both, which then leads us to our next poll, which is to find out what kinds of tools did your organization provide to you back in March of 2020? And feel free, if you have a question that comes up as we're going, you can post your questions anytime, and we will look at those as we get to the question time. So give it about 5 more seconds. I think the good news here is that over 50% of you had everything you needed immediately. And maybe that is also tied to the fact that more than 30% of you said that you were working remotely already. So you already had those systems in place. Almost 30% of you said that over time they were provided. And that's, I think, what I heard, and for the most part in those first couple of months, was just companies having enough VPNs and people having enough bandwidth with their internet at home to be able to get into those VPNs and work somewhat efficiently. I'm sad to say that even after 15 or 16 months, some of you are still waiting for better tools and training, and consistently, some of you did not work remotely, so this wasn't an issue. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. So here is where we get to the questions piece for the first time. We'd like you to share what was the most difficult aspect of working remotely, and were those difficulties addressed by your company? If so, how? And if not, why? Oops, I'm sorry, I did not mean to click that. So let me go ahead and look at some of the questions that have already been posted. Okay, we do have one person that says they're having audio issues, and that is on your end. Sorry, I think everybody else can hear us. This is your opportunity to ask some questions. I know there's got to be somebody who can ask a question. So the question is, what was the most difficult aspect of remote working? We had one person share that, that connecting with people was the most difficult aspect. And I actually agree with this. This is probably what I feel was my most difficult aspect of having our office, remote working, and it was kind of that daily connection piece, just like, hey, how you doing? But also when you have an idea or just something that you want to quickly ask a question of, is having people not available. Like, I don't want to set up a whole meeting just to ask a question, but or even picking up the phone. I don't know why we don't just pick up the phone more often, but I think that was that connecting with people piece. I've also had people share managing home and work, obviously, especially with if you have kids or people that you're caring for in your home. I mean, the distractions there had to be unimaginable. Um, that idea that you're supposed to be helping your kids with school and you're supposed to be on a call and you're supposed to be doing your work. Um, all of those things really become a challenge. One of the other comments is, just so much unknown. And this is why this period of uncertainty, we still have so much unknown. Things are getting better, especially in the US, but in other countries, it's getting better a little bit slower. And not understanding what's going to happen, what the future holds, makes it hard to even focus and concentrate for a lot of people. For me, I agree totally. We had another comment of having sufficient laptops to allow personnel to actually go remote. And that's kind of a business continuity and IT issue that we, as business continuity people, kind of have been looking at for years. Is okay, you have people working at an alternate location or remotely. Well, how are they going to get that work done? And usually the answer, the biggest problem was having sufficient laptops and then getting them all set up to actually be able to work. So first acquiring them and then being able to use them. There's another person said hard to become part of a team when you join the company during the pandemic. This is something that we talked about in our April meeting and that whole onboarding thing. So I would hope that anybody who started working a new job during the pandemic, that when you go back to work um, in person, that there'll be some onboarding going on. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a CPA and works for an accounting firm, and she was saying that yes, the work was all being done by the new people, but they didn't actually understand who the company was and how they operated. So while the tasks might be getting done, this whole idea of understanding culture and leadership and how people operate, I mean, you can't do that working remotely. And so understanding that remote, this idea of starting a new job remotely is really difficult. And being successful with that, I would think, would also be really difficult. Had some more people say this idea of separating work time from home time, not easy. Our printers weren't connected, so the security feature restricts external printers or scanners, so just managing the printing piece. And then another person said, moving from their Skype type meetings to MS Teams um, had to become a priority. And so this meant that, that was another transition and a learning that people had in place. Some part of that, some of those tools actually that we're talking about. Another person shared that just having a poor internet connection, um, they not being able to change the vendors at home because of how much the company was reimbursing. So understanding that you were expected to do your work, but your company was only reimbursing you a certain amount of money. And by the way, those internet providers, they were very, very busy um, because a lot of people were trying to upgrade as well. Something else that's being shared is that companies are now also reducing the number of leave days allotted to employees due to employees working from home. That's an interesting piece. So just because you're working from home doesn't mean you don't need a day off. Hmm, that's an interesting concept. Um, and then just an observation that companies that have full-time remote workers who have never seen other staff members, and obviously this is true, and it's really training for the manager and how to work with and motivate and encourage remote workers. I felt that sometimes as just a leader of our organization, um, just keeping people I already knew really well connected was a challenge, much less trying to get to know and train people remotely. A lot of challenges. Um, and then just to kind of close out here is sharing that one of their clients saw a 277% increase in cyber attack attempts. And we're going to talk some more about as well. I'm going to do the last two questions and then hold the rest of your comments for our next sharing time. As a remote coach, the number of burnout with employees and professional providers is extremely high. Absolutely. There's a lot of people that were working remotely as providers and coaches who were really burned out from having to maybe do a lot more than they normally would do. And then finally, as a BCP implementation officer, I realized a lot of people couldn't even remember where they've safely stored their RSA tokens. Oh yeah, there's that smiley face. There's a lot of challenges that we've had, and a lot of things to work through. And I hope by now most of those have been worked through. So we're going to talk next about some of the issues and blind spots that we're seeing, and some of those things you've already brought up, but really entering that work from home world and what that security looks like. So just some statistics. Ransomware attacks were up 150% in 2020. 150%. And they're even more in 2021. All you have to do is look at the news. This was a study done just recently in May by Harvard Business Review. And the amount of paid by victims of these attacks has increased more than 300% than in 2020. So here we're only 5 months, and this study was, less than 5 months into the 2021, and we're seeing more payments being made and the amount of money increasing. So one of the things that they've mentioned is that most audit committees and senior management who've had to make decisions around cyber attacks say they'd never imagined they'd be in a discussion on whether and how much ransom to pay to hackers who were holding their companies hostage. Microsoft study said that only 20% of the respondents said that they did not encounter any increased security threats, and 62% of the respondents reported phishing campaigns were the most increased security threats. And so as part of that, worker concerns appeared to be related to downloading content and accessing work information on that private Wi-Fi networks that may not be as secure as their work connections, and in line with security professionals' secure concerns, falling victim to those phishing scams as well. This U.S. Chamber of Commerce guide that Jim mentioned a few minutes ago said that there was a 775% increase in cloud usage, and that became a 260% increase in click-throughs and malicious URLs in the early days of the pandemic. You get everybody trained in on what to click on and what not to click on, and then you totally change their environment, and that risk environment changes as well. And due to that lack of transition to a remote working environment, cyber criminals have increased their attacks on remote login services. So that's where they've focused as well. And we've really just seen that the pandemic has provided criminals opportunities on a scale likely to dwarf anything we've seen before. So to get an idea of how much you guys have been impacted, we're going to go to our next poll and to say, have you been directly affected or experienced a data breach or incident while working remotely? One of the things that they've seen is that some of these attacks have been indiscriminate, where they used to be focused on bigger companies that could, they could give them more money, or they could get more data from. In a lot of ways, it's been indiscriminate. So small businesses have been just as at risk as larger businesses. And 60 Minutes had a really interesting show a few weeks ago where they were talking about cyber attacks and information security, and this idea that hackers are now just selling their programs off, and so the hackers don't even have to be very sophisticated because they can just purchase something to use. So I'm going to give it 2 seconds more, and then I'm going to close the survey or this poll. So interestingly enough, 76% of you have been lucky so far. 14% were hacked and were able to stabilize within a reasonable time frame. 7% were able to manage with minimal impact, and 3% of you had something that was very frustrating and a significant impact. And that statistically is also pretty much what we're seeing globally. One of the things that I did read is that for some reason, I have no idea why, but for some reason, the US has been impacted more than a lot of other countries. So just sharing, this is a kind of a cool free infographic that was put up by IT Governance USA. And they looked at early on, so this would be kind of a March through July 2020, about what kinds of arrangements have put into place. And so that what they have identified is 5 remote working risks that you should be aware of. The first one is something that we actually talked about as well, this unsecure personal devices, with home office networks being 3.5 times more likely than corporate networks to be infected by malware. When we're looking at their second thing is a surge in coronavirus themed attack. And this just seems really nasty. This seems unfair to me, where they saw an increase in business email compromise and staff impersonation fraud, where they're targeting IT teams themselves, claiming that they have issues signing in remotely. So here they're taking what's actually the biggest problem for remote workers, and they're attacking that piece. Also, cyber criminals tapping into those unsecured official coronavirus Android apps due to poor security practices used in developing those apps over a short time. So here you're going in to try to get help and learn about the coronavirus, and they're using those as fake sites to attack you. One of the things that security professionals surveyed said that 71% of them have seen an increase in security threats, and 55% are phishing related, as we mentioned earlier. So that's kind of a common theme, followed by malicious websites promising information on the pandemic. Again, is that really not fair? As well as malware at 28% and ransom attacks at 19%. I think both Jim and Tatiana mentioned that heightened criminal activity targeted at VPNs. And even at the very beginning of the pandemic, the hacks into this was at 165% than normal. We're going to be talking about cloud-based tools a little bit more, and Jim was talking about some of the attacks specifically at the communication tools. And I think Zoom was one of the newest tools into the marketplace, and they were found to have some of the more vulnerabilities. In fact, I know of several companies who don't even allow you to use Zoom. One of the things that I'm sure, and Zoom has been busy, not to slam Zoom, but this is just a fact, is that they were hit hardest of some of the tools, and they've been putting in improvements, obviously, since then. But one of the things that they were able to do was to secure Windows passwords, to take over the Zoom users' Mac data, and tap into their webcam and microphone. That's always nice. There are also reports that Apple was forced to step in to secure millions of devices after it learned that Zoom installed a secret web server on users' Macs. So it seems like the vulnerability here seems to be between Zoom and Mac and Apple. But they also found that there's an attendee tracking feature that lets the host see whether participants clicked away from the app during the call that was able to be hacked into. And then there was Zoom bombing. And one of my kids was actually telling me that they were doing this really great Zoom meeting on diversity and inclusion, and they were totally Zoom bombed, and they had to close it down. So this is when uninvited guests enter these meetings and try to impact those. And I think the biggest issue is the lack of remote working policies and procedures. So for those of you that have been remote working, I'm assuming your companies have some sort of policies and procedures because they already have that in place. But a lot of companies didn't have that in place. And so there wasn't very much time to develop those home policies and procedures, sometimes only days. And so, having to deploy something without having those arrangements in place have increased those data security and privacy risks. And then there's the possibility of that compromised backup processes, or a lack of effective vulnerability scanning, having to put in patching and access control measures, as well as that overall reduction in information security controls, just due to staff availability and responsiveness on the information security side. The information and cybersecurity professionals, a lot of them are also working remotely. And then there was seen an increased risk of the PCI and DSS noncompliance due to the way credit card data was being processed by some of the remote workers. So this is something that you may have to address when you move, or start if you're looking at compliance and regulatory issues and certification pieces. So we do know that cyber criminals increase their attacks on remote logins. So Trend Micro reported that there was over 1.2 million attempts made to compromise remote login services, with 89% of those being executed through brute force. They saw 1 million spam messages sent in a very short time, with 48,000 hits on malicious URLs and 737 pieces of malware detected. That's a lot of things to manage. And all of this was tailored with that content relevant to COVID. So very specifically targeting people who were trying to learn more about the pandemic itself. So one of the things we need to really have an understanding of is that attack surface. So when we broadened where people are working, that attack surface is also broadened. And so what's happening is that baggage, or that risk baggage that comes along with home offices and segmentation practices, is kind of going out the window. And so this is why you need to really have policies and practices in place and get that training in place as well. Because you can't expect people to understand all of the risks that are involved with the security pieces. So when you're connecting to corporate networks via your home networks and routers, how do you ensure that the home network endpoints are as secure as the traditional home office? Is that even possible? Also understand that data stored on portable devices needs to be safe within the home environments, or if you're transiting between one place and another, which means you might have to actually look at home security, because now you've got a lot of work equipment sitting at home environments. And actually understanding how critical security information is being stored and transmitted when you have that remote work happening, and how to do that safely. And we've always talked about, making sure that you're not leaving personal information on your desks, but now you've got home desks and neglected space at the office. So what does that mean? So really understanding your workforce and trying to get a handle on what is that attack space. Microsoft has a little bit more from their study, is that given the expectation that employees are going to work from home, potentially in a hybrid environment where maybe you're working from home sometimes and back at the office other times, they say we all agree that that's going to continue post-COVID. So they are accelerating their moves to the cloud, and also, of course, increasing their overall IT spending. And so what they've seen is that the budgets that they had for 2020 were completely blown, and that additional finances needed to be put in place in order to manage some of those changes, because it is really going to be the responsibility of the company to help people balance their ability to provide their staff um, not only with a convenient and productive remote environment, but make sure it's safe and resilient as well. So kind of our next participant sharing has to do with describing any security incidents you or your company experienced due to having remote workers. So let me go ahead and take a look at some of those questions. I know there were more questions. Hang on, let me figure out. I'm having a little bit of my own technical issue to see the questions. So give me 1 second. I clicked on something that made the questions too small for me to see. So let me just close that and stop it and see if I can change something else. Or Jim, if you can help me out here so I'm not missing the questions. All right, I was able to get them to pop out. One of the questions was, do you see any issue in our skills lacking while working remotely? So I'm going to hold that one for our guest speakers to share. We know that some employees' home broadband was not sufficient. One of the other comments or questions is Amazon new sharing sidewalk. How does that impact us? That I'm not familiar with. So hopefully Jim or Tatiana know about that. I'm not familiar with that. So it's called the Amazon's sharing sidewalk. And then one person shared that they had a data breach as a result of an employee using home banking on their work computer. So that's actually interesting. That's something that we haven't really talked about much, is now people have their work computers and they're using it for home types of things. So that's an interesting thing that, what are your policies for that? And maybe you need to have some. Another person shared that a lost their laptop. This is actually one of the biggest risks that has been a risk for a long time, is people purely having their laptops stolen. And the RSA token and the password was on the same piece of paper in the same bag. So maybe we need policies that help decide, you know, if you're traveling with your laptop, how you also travel with any of your passwords and your tokens. Another question is who pays for the increases in employee bandwidth and cell phones? That's a really big question. So I have heard from people that um, companies are now paying, they ask you to show your invoices previous to the pandemic and then show your increases, and they're willing to pay for the increases. But if your broadband isn't strong enough, you need to actually increase its capacity. It's also interesting. So Diana shared, it's Amazon sharing the internet in the neighborhood. Still not sure what that is, but that's definitely something I'm going to um, I'm going to look into. One of the people, then the person that got their laptop stolen, said that they actually got the laptop back after 2 days, and we did a check to see if it was ever logged in, but it wasn't sure that the user actually got access, which is really interesting. Like you actually have all the information there, and then the person didn't actually use it. That's an interesting thing. Any other security incidents that you want to share before we move on? Okay. So reflections from Jim and Tatiana. How do you need to ensure security from for a remote workforce? Because we know obviously that security activities have been impacted by that shift to remote work.
Yeah. I will start first. When it comes to enabling remote work, the strategy in general can be, there is a, how to say, standard, maybe steps. And one of these is to create safe and effective foundation for remote digital access and provide secure remote access to business assets and online services. And we talk about this through VPNs or multi-factor authentications, etc. Also, organizations should provide secure access to business applications and communication collaboration tools. They have to ensure that the security risk assessment of third-party providers and their tools or software tools is conducted to ensure that providers have sufficient security controls in place and good security tools to make sure that you implement tools that meet your security requirements. Also, develop remote working skills to ensure good work cooperation between teams. And we talk about the awareness, guidance for the people, and policies and procedures in place to ensure that the people are aware with all these threats that we talk about and risks. And the last but not least, cultivate a remote working culture and mindset for all of the people to make sure that also to create and demonstrate a supportive environment for getting up to speed on remote work can be a short-term objective and medium-term investment. So it's from one point, this is an objective, and another point is investment from the leadership team, and to ensure that they will provide the tools, the knowledge of the people that work remotely, and to ensure that this environment is secure. Jim, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you. Let me expand a little bit from that very, very concise information security, cybersecurity. I've also been doing 22301 or business continuity management system audits. So a difference I've seen from pre-pandemic, during pandemic to present is in the documentation, define what a remote worker is. In pre-pandemic, most of the definition talked about, here's my normal department, and you would get a table that said, how would I, over time, bring my team back over hours, days, or weeks? And would that be in a different work area or transfer work or relocation? So changing that remote worker definition, to the last couple of audits, I've asked a simple definition. What is a remote worker? To me, I see three definitions. It's somebody, going back to the poll, that has been working remotely for a period of time based on their job duties and they're used to it. Maybe they're at their home office and managing a region and people remotely. Then the traditional table of how do I return to business or use an alternate work area, whether it's internal or something that you get in the marketplace from the vendors. Now we have the COVID capability. So maybe redefining clarity of that. And then I'll expand a little bit on the risk side of that. Pre-pandemic, if you were doing a risk assessment, you would pick out the street addresses of your sites to see what was going on there. Now I'm seeing more and more organizations that have to expand that from the traditional office to maybe taking a look at where their people are located remotely, whether that's in a neighborhood or a postal zip code or a telephony area code, so they can see and get a sense for risk or actual events that may be happening that may impact some of their employees that are not in a hardened office facility. So again, expanding a little bit different to that. And I'm also looking at just two other things, and then I'll hand it back, which is one, individuals that are at home and you're working at home, if you have a technical problem, whether it's just a problem with your device or maybe it's an attack, in the pre-pandemic days, you could call the help or service desk and maybe get somebody to come up and see what was occurring. Now you're remote. So if your device isn't working, perhaps you need to then pick up the telephone and make a call and see if you can get remote access from your support. Or how does that affect your ability of maybe you have more downtime where someone has to visit you, one of your suppliers, or you need to take your device to an office or a source or get it replenished. So that's kind of a little bit different. Is the remote worker and the risk and the business. So, and I'll hand it back. Linda.
All right, so our final piece of today's webinar is to talk about, has remote work affected your information security management system? So we're going to take our last poll and we'd like to get an understanding of, what kinds of standards or regulations or laws do you need to be compliant with? And this is a choose all that apply, so you can click as many of them as applicable to you. And we're going to leave this open for about 20 seconds. And one of the things that Jim mentioned was, I think we really need to stick with the term remote worker because you don't know where that person's working. And so more and more people who, and this is kind of different around the world, but, their home isn't the best place for them to work, are actually working in rented spaces that are being provided, office spaces that are renting out desks and all the infrastructure that goes with that. And so here is where I think that we're going to see a change in some of our real estate too, where cities may be losing real estate for companies, but they may be able to pick up a little bit different. So let's take a look at our polls. Interestingly enough, I'm not surprised that GDPR is something that a lot of you need to be compliant with. Obviously, NIST in the US and all the information security is a big deal, as well as ISO 27000 series. But the 48% of the PCI DSS is interesting, and 40% of HIPAA still too. So there's a lot of people that attending this that have to be compliant with a lot of things, but 28% of you don't have to be compliant with anything. And so maybe this is an opportunity for those of you that don't need to be compliant to anything to improve your controls by starting to be aligned to 27001 and looking at what that means to help build a more secure system. So as we close up with our final reflections, what do you see as some of the potential changes to the ISO 27001 certification process? And then we do have a question or two that I'll answer at the end.
Okay, maybe because there are two questions here, what are SMS implications, and for the first question, I think single-handedly the largest shift that I'm seeing for regional and global organizations is a change from a local server network to a cloud-based network solution. We are starting to see whole networks and infrastructure built upon cloud-based solutions to include Office 365, SharePoint, OneDrive solutions. This reduces some of the concerns about server capacity scalability based on data needs. With each licensed user, an additional 10 gigabytes of OneDrive space is added to the collective, and by definition, this is all remote-based access. For potential changes in the ISO 27000 standard and audit, from the information security management requirements of ISO 27001-2013, the requirements remain unchanged. What has changed is how the remote workforce post-pandemic affects an organization's identity, context, and stakeholders. Additionally, mature organizations will be re-evaluating their risk assessment and opportunities in the post-pandemic remote era. There are newer cloud-based standards as well and requirements that businesses may also consider. And these include ISO 27017 cloud services. Cloud computing has its own types of risk sources, including threats and vulnerabilities, which are derived from its feature, including network scalability, elasticity of the system, resource sharing, self-service provisioning, administration on demand, cross-jurisdictional service provisioning, and limited visibility into the implementation of controls. The standard provides also cloud-based guidance of 37 of the controls in ISO 27002, but also features new cloud controls in the area of roles and responsibilities, asset management, virtual environment and machines, customer responsibilities, and activity monitoring. Another standard is 27018, ISO 27018, PII in public cloud. Typically, an organization implementing ISO 27001 is protecting its own information assets. However, in the context of personal data protection requirements for a public cloud service provider, the organization is protecting the information assets entrusted to it by its customers. ISO 27018 helps the service provider to comply with the obligations associated with PII data protection by having the right processes and service agreements. Encryption of data in motion, deletion of PII data, and purpose of data processing with optimal transparency to the customer. Jim, maybe you have some thoughts?
Thank you, Tatiana, and thanks for those updates as standards continued to grow. That was very helpful. Let me go back to the U.S. Chamber thing, a Commerce report that you folks may want to take a look at. One is kind of around what we've been talking about, which is the old bring your own device, BYOD. And they have some guidance on there for around cybersecurity and the variety or portfolio of different tools that you might want to have versus just one. Whether it ranges from the pop-up blockers and the malware, firewalls, of course, and disabling selective applications. So that's one element inside of there to take a look at. And the other element that we've probably seen is third-party and supplier costs and supplier risk. And we've all probably seen and been impacted by increased material cost or decreased availability, whether it's a building material or a chip or technology. And that leads to a longer and much unknown or variable lead times. I need something and I'm ordering it, I expect it to come, and you wait. So when that comes to actually responding to incidents or problems or events or crisis, what you normally would anticipate might become extended in that timeline. So something to consider as we continue to work our way through this. Then one other item is around cybersecurity. So we saw, as Linda indicated earlier, ransomware is increased. So I'm not sure if anybody's done the research to link this together, but there seems to be some coincidence, whether it's driven by geopolitical or nation states, but it does seem that we also have more and more cryptocurrencies. So the old days of kind of ransoming or kidnapping people or data, showing up with a suitcase full of cash on the action TVs, those are gone because people would get caught. And then with the cyber thing, it's like, okay, gift cards, but they're lower value, maybe a few $100s. Now you have cyber and cryptocurrencies. So you can send a lot more money on that ransomware, and it's more challenging for not only organizations, but law enforcement to identify that bad actor. But where's the line? Here's a key point, and I haven't seen it defined consistently. Say you have that work at home and there's some crossover. If ransomware, where's the line of what the company or the organization is responsible for? Or if it comes from an employee or personal, where's that line between the individual and the organizations? And finally, how many of your staff, if they're trying to get themselves out of a ransomware situation, would even have a clue of where to start, how to do that, where to pay, and how to figure that whole thing out? So I think that's going to be a game changer. And finally, I think the audit process will adjust. We're able to go forward because the requirements are there. And as Tatiana so professionally and nimbly put it, but as auditors or as organization being audited, we're going to see more and more remote tours we're getting comfortable with and being able to figure that out. And there's information you can pick up. Remote document reviews will add some time, I think. If you're reviewing a BIA or risk assessment or a strategy or a statement of applicability and somebody else is driving, being able to keep up and get the information the auditor needs to accomplish their objective may take some time, some speed reading to accomplish those clause requirements. So I think there's some adjustments that would cause us as auditors to be able to pivot. And we need to change our styles also, or maybe show me. We'll just touch on a couple things before I hand it back to Linda. Lessons learned kind of throughout the pandemic and remote meeting. On a lighter note, I said, 2 key lessons. When do you mute and when do you unmute? Second, along with that, what are on your screen? Are you sharing a specific document Or are you sharing your entire screen where there might be additional sensitive information? And it was alluded to, what about when you're in a meeting and you have your camera going? What can be seen that's sensitive in the background information? You know, are you putting up filters? Are you trying to look like an emu? Or are people seeing your home, your house, your personal pets? Are they seeing your art preference, decorations? What's personally identifiable? And of course, then we get that exposure window when your camera. And I think we probably have all heard or been exposed to some maybe embarrassing situation when you have a camera active and some other member of your household maybe moves through there and they're not aware your camera is active. So just on a lighter note, I'll leave those couple of quick thoughts over and I'll hand it back to Linda.
Thanks. Just in closing, I wanted to share a couple more of the comments from the participants. Challenge, we haven't talked about access to UPSs during blackouts. So we were actually having a little bit of a worry right before we started this webinar, is that our power went out for about 10 seconds and then everything had to reboot. So we were a little bit nervous about that. Another person shared that a friend of theirs and their spouse worked for competing banks, and they had to share the same workspace, and so that was a real stressful time for them to be having to try to be safe in what they were saying. And then the follow-up on Amazon Sidewalk, it says that there's many customers worried about privacy and other security risks with that, so you'll have to look into that. So just in closing, after the webinar, when you get your certificate, you will receive these links so that you can take a look and learn more about those. We invite you to join us on our remaining webinars throughout the rest of this year. Of course, follow us, stay in touch. We appreciate that. And just to close, this will be included, so that you can see that as well. But if you'd like to contact Charlie, who wasn't able to be with us today, he can share with you information about Intertek, as well as answer any other questions that you may have about remote work and information security practices. So thank you for your time today, and have a good rest of the week. And we just want to also, don't let me forget to thank Tatiana and Jim for sharing today as our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you.